The camp had been standing for 11 months, which was 11 months longer than anyone thought it would. That is what they always said about relief operations, that they were temporary, that the population would be resettled, that the transit corridors would open, and the checkpoints would ease, and the families would move on. They said it again and again, until the saying of it became a kind of maintenance, something you did to keep the machinery of official optimism running, while the tents multiplied and the water queues grew longer, and the census rolls filled with names that no longer had addresses attached to them. I had been at Camp Divin 6 for 3 of those 11 months. Divin 6 was not my first assignment. Before this one, I had spent 4 months at the intake staging yards on the Thresh border, and before that, 8 months in the agricultural relay stations of the outer Voreth corridor, where displaced farming families waited for land use adjudications that were always 6 weeks away. I had been doing this work for 4 years. I was not young when I started, and I was not old now, but the work had a way of settling into you, into the creases around your eyes, into the weight of your hands, into the particular flat efficiency with which you moved through a crowd of 1,200 people, as though moving through a crowd of 1,200 people were simply a thing a person did. My name is Tor Calvin. I am 37 years old. I am from a farm town on the eastern coast of a continent that most of the people at Camp Divin 6 had never heard of, and they had not heard of it because it was on Earth, and Earth was not a place that most of them had occasion to think about in any but the most abstract terms. The Compact's humanitarian auxiliary was staffed largely by human contractors. We were cheap to deploy, willing to go where allied species relief personnel were reluctant to follow, and most of us had been trained to keep our opinions about that arrangement to ourselves. I was assigned to the distribution and intake wing. Practically, this meant I spent most of my days at a folding table inside a prefabricated structure that smelled of pressed polymer and too many bodies, processing new arrivals and managing the daily ration cycle. Every morning I received a manifest from the Compact supply chain. Every morning I cross-checked it against the census rolls. Every morning there were discrepancies, and every morning I worked through them by hand, because the automated systems had a 40-year-old architecture and a 40-year-old tendency to collapse under load. I was good at this work. I want to say that plainly, because there is no modesty in what I am about to tell you, and the plainness helps me tell it clearly. I was good at the work because I paid attention, and because I had a memory for faces and names that my supervisor, an Orathi woman named Sel Voren, called inconvenient. She called it inconvenient because I noticed things she would have preferred went unnoticed. I noticed when the medical allocation was shorted by 8% and filed a formal query. I noticed when the perimeter census missed an entire sector of new tents and walked it myself at 0600 to update the count. I noticed, after my 3rd week at Divin 6, that the woman in row 14 was not who the intake form said she was. I noticed because of her hands. I should explain that. Hands are what I look at. Not because I am strange about it, I have had that suggestion made, and I reject it, but because in relief work, hands tell you what everything else has been coached to conceal. In the Thresh Dominion intake yards, I had learned to read Thresh hands for the particular grip patterns that indicated which caste tier a person came from, regardless of what their travel documents said. In the Voreth corridor stations, I had learned to read the callous distribution that distinguished subsistence farming hands from the administrative hands that had claimed subsistence farming status to jump the queue. It was not foolproof. Nothing in this work was foolproof, but it gave me an edge. The woman in row 14 had hands that did not match her intake form. Her form said she was from the Ashvileth agricultural region, which was accurate in the sense that the Ashvileth agricultural region was a real place, a belt of river delta farmland in the middle principality of the same name, destroyed in the 3rd month of the Drevi incursion. Most of the people in row 14 were from that region or adjacent ones. Her form said she was a district record keeper, widowed, traveling alone. The age listed was consistent with her appearance. She had given the name Nari Vel, and nothing about the name drew attention. Vel was common in the Ashvilith region, a suffix indicating regional origin, and Nari was an ordinary given name that half the adult women in the Delta corridor seemed to share. But her hands. District record keepers in the Delta corridor had hands shaped by stylus work and document sorting. I had processed 63 of them in the past 3 months, and I knew the grip and the callus pattern the way a carpenter knows wood grain. The woman in row 14 had hands that were narrower, the joints more pronounced, the skin at the knucklebacks showing the particular wear pattern of gauntlet use. Gauntlet use, in the Ashvilith Principality tradition, was not a record keeper's habit. It was a formal ceremony habit, the kind of habit you developed over years of wearing heavy ceremonial dress gauntlets at court functions. I noticed this on a Tuesday. I did not act on it that day, because acting immediately and obviously is how you spook people who have reason to be afraid, and in a refugee camp, everyone has reason to be afraid. I filed the observation in the back of my mind and went on with the day's distribution. I noticed her again on Thursday, when she came through the ration line. She did not speak unnecessarily. This was common. Many of the people at Diven 6 had been through enough checkpoints and intake interviews that they had learned to strip their public presence down to the minimum required information. She held her ration card with a careful precision that the people behind her in line did not. She had a way of standing that I had seen before, not in agricultural workers or district record keepers, but in compact diplomatic sessions, where the principals sat with a particular, contained stillness that was not the stillness of exhaustion but the stillness of long training. She had dark eyes. Not a dark I had a specific word for, a deep amber brown at the center that went darker toward the edges, the kind of eyes that seemed to be doing a great deal of thinking while the face above them remained still. Her skin was the color of pale dark riverstone, a cool undertone that deepened to near charcoal at the jaw. Her hair had been cut short, close to the head, and not recently. The growth was about 6 weeks out, and the original cut had been even, the kind of even that came from a barber who was paid to be precise. She was not wearing anything that distinguished her, a plain gray evacuation tunic, standard-issue refugee's carry bag, boots that had seen better days. But the boots were wrong. Not obviously wrong, the wrong was in the stitching at the ankle joint, a reinforced seam pattern I had seen on formal dress footwear adapted for hard use. Someone had taken formal footwear and resoled it for walking, and they had done it well, but they had left the original seam intact because the original seam was load-bearing in a way that mattered, and removing it would have weakened the boot structure. On Thursday, I set down her ration tray, vegetable broth, grain cake, 2 packets of supplement, and I said, in the flat register I used for intake processing, "Name and census number for verification, please." She said them, Nari Vel, census number 471-12. Her voice was even. I looked at her for a moment, not long. I was not trying to alarm her. I said also flatly, "The broth's hot today, better than last week." "Thank you," she said. "You're from the Delta corridor, the form says." "Yes." "Ashvilith." A pause, short but there. "Yes." I picked up the next tray for the person behind her and said, without looking back at her, "The ration schedules are posted by sector each morning. Row 14's is around 1000. If the line's long, the secondary window in Block C usually moves faster." She said thank you again and moved on. I thought about her for the rest of the day. The Ashvilith Principality had been a client state of the Compact's middle corridor for about 200 years before the Dreva incursion. It was not a large principality. It had about 4 million people and a modest planetary economy built on river agriculture, specialized textile production, and a financial sector that punched above its weight because of the Ashvilith family's centuries-old treaty relationships with 3 of the Compact's major exchange houses. The Ashvileth ruling family had governed the principality by continuous succession for 11 generations, which was not remarkable by galactic standards. There were noble houses that had managed 20 or 30, but was remarkable by the principality's own history, given that it had survived 2 previous incursions and a civil succession dispute in the 4th generation. The last head of the Ashvileth ruling line was Queen Naren Ashvileth. I knew this because I had looked it up. Not on Thursday. I had looked it up months ago during my intake orientation, when the Compact Auxiliary had given us a regional history brief covering all the displaced populations flowing into the transit camps. The brief had been comprehensive, and I had read all of it, because that is the kind of person I am, and because in relief work, knowing who the people in front of you were before the disaster is how you begin to understand who they are now. Queen Naren Ashvileth had been 29 at the time of the incursion. The brief had included a formal portrait. A formal portrait I reflected on Thursday evening, taken under state conditions with full diplomatic styling, which meant state hair, which meant nothing at all like 6 weeks of field-cut growth, and state dress, which meant nothing like an evacuation tunic, and state expression, which meant a composed formality that had probably been practiced since childhood. But the hands were the same, the eyes were the same, the way of standing was the same. On Friday morning, I went to Sel Voren's office and closed the door. Sel looked up from her manifest queue. She was a small woman, Orathi, with the 3-jointed fingers and the deep copper-green skin of her species, and she had the permanent expression of someone managing more complexity than any one reasonable person should be expected to manage. She said, "If this is about the medical allocation short count, I already filed the escalation." "It's not about that," I said. "I think we have someone in census who is not registered under her real identity." Sel set down her work and looked at me the way she always looked at me when I was about to complicate her morning. "Tell me." I told her what I had observed. The hands, the boots, the posture, the pause on the word Ashvileth. When I was done, Sel was quiet for a moment. "You're saying you think we have a royal in row 14, she said. "I'm saying I think we have someone who was trained in formal Ashvileth court protocols, wearing adapted formal footwear, with gauntlet callus patterns, living under an ordinary name in a tent camp. That could be a number of people." "It could be," I said, "but the name she gave is Nari Vel. Nari is the informal diminutive of Naren in the regional dialect. Vel is the common suffix, but it's also the first syllable of Veleth." Sel looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "What do you want to do with this?" "Nothing right now," I said. "I don't want to report it to the Compact administrative channel. If she's hiding, there's a reason she's hiding, and blowing her cover to a channel that might have Drevi monitoring is not something I want on my conscience." "What do you want to do?" Sel said again. "I want to make sure she's all right," I said. "I want to make sure the camp knows who she is, at least at our level, so that if something happens, we can respond appropriately. And I want to wait to see if she trusts us enough to tell us herself." Sel thought about this for a while. Then she said, "You're aware that if you're wrong, you've spent considerable energy on a coincidence." "I'm aware." "And if you're right?" "If I'm right," I said, "then we are currently housing the last surviving member of the Ashvileth ruling line in a 6 by 8 meter tent with 4 other people, and she's eating grain cake and vegetable broth." Sel was quiet, then she said, "Keep it between us. Watch, don't move." I agreed. That was Friday. On Saturday, I was assigned to the Eastern Sector distribution, which took me away from the row 14 ration line. On Sunday, the camp received a large new intake from the Veleth corridor collapse, nearly 300 people in one convoy, arriving in 9 transport vehicles that had clearly been traveling for a long time, and all hands went to intake processing. I did not see Nari Vel for 3 days. When I did see her again, it was because she came to Block C. Block C was the secondary services block, medical screening, document support, and the communications relay where people could attempt to reach family members through the compact's displaced persons network. The relay was perpetually busy. There were 12 terminals and the queue was always at least 2 hours long. People spent those 2 hours sitting on polymer benches in the corridor outside the relay room, waiting for their number to be called. And the waiting was a particular kind of waiting, quiet, internal, the waiting of people who had been learning to hold their hope carefully because it had been dropped before. I was walking through Block C on my way to the document support counter when I saw her in the relay queue. She was sitting on the bench with the same contained stillness I had noticed in the ration line. She had a queue number in her hand. Around her, people talked quietly or stared at the middle distance. She was looking at the queue number. I stopped, considered, and went to the document support counter and started my shift. An hour and 40 minutes later, her number was called. I was close enough to the relay room that I could see the terminal she sat at. I was not watching her. I was doing my work. But you develop a peripheral awareness in this job. You learn to register unusual movement or sound without directing your attention at it, the way a teacher learns to track a restless classroom while keeping their eyes on the whiteboard. What I registered peripherally was that she sat at the terminal for 11 minutes, and then she stood up, and she stood up with a particular quality of movement, deliberate, careful, the movement of someone putting something carefully away inside themselves. And she walked out of the relay room and sat back down on the bench in the corridor and did not move for a long time. I finished my shift at the document counter and went out into the corridor and sat down on the bench 2 spaces away from her. I did not say anything for a while. This was, I had found, often more respectful than speaking. In the first months of relief work, I had tried to fill silences with something, and I had learned that most of the time, the silence was not empty. It was occupied, and the best thing I could do was let the person occupy it in peace. After a while she said, without looking at me, "Did you find what you were looking for? In the census?" I looked at her. "You were watching me," she said. "Not in a threatening way, but you were watching. You are the one who said the broth was hot." "I did say that," I said. "You also know enough to say Ashvileth in a tone that is not the tone people use for a region they don't care about." I considered this. Then I said, "I read the regional history brief. Most relief workers don't." "I'm aware," I said. She was quiet. Then she said, "I'm not going to tell you who I am." "You don't have to," I said. "But I think you know." "I think," I said carefully, "that you are someone who has a very good reason for being here under the name you gave, and that you are not a danger to anyone in this camp, and that what happens next is between you and whatever you need to do next." She turned to look at me then. The dark amber-brown eyes, the quality of stillness around her face that was not blankness but the controlled surface of something much larger underneath. "I was trying to reach the compact missing persons registry," she said, "through the relay." "I know, that's what the relay is for." "I was looking for a name." She stopped, started again. "There was someone who did not come through the evacuation with me. The last confirmed report I had was from the Velith City collapse in month 3 of the incursion." She stopped again. "I'm sorry," I said. "He was human," she said, as if this were a fact that required stating precisely. "He was a relief contractor. He had come to the Principality through the compact humanitarian auxiliary 14 months before the incursion. He was not a soldier. He was not a diplomat. He was assigned to the agricultural relay stations in the Eastern Delta, and I met him at a Water Systems Commission meeting that he attended to provide supply chain documentation, and neither of us expected." She stopped. I was quiet. "The formal protocols of the Principality," she said after a moment, "do not have a category for a bond that forms between a queen and a human contractor. There are partnership protocols, and there are alliance protocols, and there are documented cases of off-world consort bonds with various allied species. But for a human, there was nothing in the codex. We had to write it ourselves. That sounds like a lot of work, I said. The smallest thing happened in her face. Not a smile exactly. The ghost of a reflex, the memory of a smile, surfacing briefly and then going back down. It was, she said. He was very methodical about it. He said if we were going to do it correctly, we should find out what correctly meant and then do that. And if there was no guidance, we should write the guidance so that whoever came after us would have something to start from. That sounds like something a relief contractor would say, I said. It is exactly what a relief contractor would say, she said. He was the kind of person who thought about the people who would come after him, about having things in order, about making sure the work would carry on even if he didn't. She was quiet for a moment. The last time I saw him was in the Velith City Administrative Building, she said. The incursion had reached the outer districts. We had 8 hours before the evacuation window closed. He told me to go. He was still trying to get the Principality's digital archive out through the secure relay, 300 years of census records, land registrations, legal instruments. The kind of record that takes generations to build and a day to destroy. Did he get it out? I said. Yes, she said. The archive is confirmed in compact custody. He completed the transfer. But the report I received 3 weeks after the evacuation, through compact administrative channels, said the building collapsed in the 4th-day orbital bombardment. That he was listed in the Velith City Casualty Assessment as missing presumed. Missing presumed. In displacement crisis documentation, missing presumed was not a confirmation. It was an administrative acknowledgement that no confirmed report existed, and that given the circumstances, the operational determination was toward loss. It was how the machinery processed the unbearable, not as certainty, but as probability, stated in a tone that left no room for anything else. His name was in the relay registry, she said, under the missing persons category. I said nothing. When I searched the registry, she said, his name was still in the missing persons category, not the confirmed loss category, the missing persons category. She looked at the queue number in her hand. That may mean nothing. The records are incomplete. The relay registry has a known lag of several months for the Velith corridor, but it may, she stopped. It may mean something, I said. Yes, she said, it may mean something. I looked at the queue number in her hand. Then I looked at her face. I need to be careful about what I say next, and how I say it, because what happened next is the kind of thing that has no good framing. No framing that doesn't sound like a constructed story. The kind of thing that happens in narration but not in life. And yet it happened in life, on a polymer bench in a prefabricated corridor in a transit camp that smelled of too many people and had been standing for 11 months. I said, what was his name? She told me. The name she said was my name. I have reconstructed the next few minutes from the outside, because I was not, in that moment, operating from the inside. I was operating from a place that was further back than thought, that prior register where the body knows something before the mind has processed it, and acts before it can catch up. What I know is this. She said the name. My name. The full name that I had not used in 14 months, not since the Principality records transfer, not since the Velith City Administrative Building, not since the point at which I had been extracted from the building's lower floors by a compact emergency response team and taken to a medical transit station with a collapsed left shoulder and a concussion that had taken 3 weeks to clear. 3 weeks in a compact medical facility under a standard intake designation, during which the Velith corridor had descended further into crisis, and the administrative records of who had been where in month 3 of the incursion had become, charitably, chaotic. I had spent the following 11 months trying to find her. I had filed the standard missing persons queries. I had gone through the compact's displaced persons network. I had, at the end of the month I was cleared for field work, requested an assignment to the Velith corridor transit camps, because if she was in the camps, that was where I needed to be. I had been at 3 camps before Diven 6. I had looked at census rolls. I had processed intake forms. I had watched the ration lines with a specific quality of attention that my supervisor Sel Voren had called inconvenient, and that was, in fact, the attention of a person who was looking for one particular face among thousands. I had not found her because she was not registered under her name. She was registered under Nari Vel. She had not found me because I was registered under my compact auxiliary designation, which was a number and a contractor code, not a name, and the compact's missing persons relay linked entries by name to name and did not cross-reference contractor codes. We had been in the same camp for 3 months. In those 3 months, I had walked every sector of Diven 6 at least twice. I had volunteered for the early morning perimeter counts, which took me through the tent rows before the day's activity began, when the light was still pale and the camp was at its quietest, and you could move through it slowly enough to actually see it. I had taken extra shifts at the secondary services block, where the transit population spent long hours waiting for the relay terminals, because the relay was where people went when they were looking for someone. I had lingered at the water distribution point in the evenings, which was the camp's informal social hour, when the day's logistics were finished, and the people who had energy left gathered in loose clusters and talked. I was not strategic about it, or rather, I was strategic in the way that relief work makes you strategic, which is to say I was patient and methodical and I did not stop, and if there is a strategy in that, it is not a clever one. It is only the strategy of a person who has decided that stopping is not an option and has organized his behavior accordingly. The previous 3 camps had been the same. At the Velith Corridor staging facility, I had processed 4,900 intake forms in 4 months, and I knew the face in each of them, not because I had a particular gift for faces, but because I looked. At the secondary transit hub at Rath Crossing, I had spent 3 months arguing with the compact administrative channel about the lag time in the missing persons relay update cycle, because the lag time was the reason people like me could not find people like her, and if I was going to keep looking, I needed the system to work better. They had updated the cycle frequency 3 months after I stopped being their problem. I counted this as a partial success. At the Diven 6 intake orientation, my supervisor Sel Voren had looked at my file and said, "You've transferred between camps 4 times in 14 months. That's unusual for a contractor at your tenure level." "I requested the transfers," I said. "I can see that. The documentation says operational redeployment by request. It doesn't say why." I told her why. She had looked at me for a moment and then looked back at my file and said, "The Ashvelith Queen is listed as missing presumed. Her entire court line is listed as missing presumed." "Missing presumed is not confirmed loss," I said. "No," she said, "it's not." She had looked at me for another moment. Then she had said, "I'll put you on distribution and intake. You'll see everyone who comes through." I thanked her. She had waved it off, in the particular way of people who are doing something kind and find the acknowledgement of it inconvenient. That had been 3 months ago. What I know is that she said my name and I turned around. That is the part I can reconstruct clearly. She said the name, and I turned, and she was looking at me, at my face, with an expression that I had no category for, and that I could only describe afterward as the expression of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told, without warning, that they could put it down. She stood up. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would have been equal to what was happening. The words that existed were all too small for it. She took 1 step, and then she stopped, because she was the kind of person who, even in a moment like this, even after 14 months, even with her eyes doing what they were doing, she was the kind of person who needed to be sure, who would not allow herself the relief until she was certain, who had been trained too long in the difference between hope and truth to let one pass for the other. "Tor," she said, not the full name, just the first name. The way she had always said it, slightly formal, as if she were still calibrating, even after all the calibrating we had done together. Naren, I said. She closed her eyes. I got up from the bench and crossed the 2 spaces between us, and she was already holding out one hand, not reaching, not grasping, just presenting it, the way you present something that belongs to someone else, and I took it in both of mine and held it. That was all, that was enough. We stood there in the corridor of Block C in Camp Divin 6, with the relay queue moving around us and the polymer-smelling air and the fluorescent light panels overhead. And she held my hand and did not cry, because she was the kind of person who had been containing things for 14 months and did not yet know that she could stop. And I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the holding wasn't already saying. After a while she said, very quietly, I thought. I know, I said. The building. I know, I was in the lower floors. The emergency team got me out. You were in the registry, she said. Missing persons. I know, I've been trying to update it. The compact's administrative lag. 11 months, she said. 11 months, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the archive. Safe, I said. Compact custody. The full transfer completed before the collapse. Something moved in her face. Something that had nothing to do with me. Something older and deeper. The particular relief of a person who has been carrying a responsibility and can now confirm that the thing they were responsible for survived. All 300 years, I said. Yes, she said very softly, yes. We stood there for a while longer. The thing about relief work is that it teaches you a great deal about what people need in moments of extremity, and one of the things it teaches you is that what they need is almost never what you would think. They do not need the large gesture. They do not need the prepared words. They need the thing that confirms that the reality in front of them is real, the texture of a hand, the ordinary sound of a name, the warmth of a ration tray that is actually hot, the specificity of 300 years safe. They need the small true thing. I am not a king. I am not a warrior. I am a relief contractor from a farm town on the eastern coast of a continent that most of the people at Camp Divin 6 had never heard of, and what I had to offer was the same thing I had been offering for 4 years to 1,200 people a day, the patience of careful attention and the willingness to stay. I had stayed in the Velith City administrative building for 6 hours past the point when I should have left, finishing the archive transfer while the incursion advanced, because the records mattered and no one else was there to finish it. I had spent 11 months in transit camps, processing intake forms and watching ration lines, because she was somewhere in the system, and I was not going to stop until I found her. I did not think of these things as remarkable. They were simply what you did when the work mattered, and the person mattered, and you had the capacity to keep going. Later, when Sel Voren found out the full story, she sat across from me in her office with the expression of someone who has been handed a complication so large that it has curved back around to something else entirely, and she said, "You spent 3 months looking at census rolls for a queen." "I spent 3 months looking at census rolls for Naren," I said. "The queen part is relevant, but not the part I was looking for." Sel looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You are the most inconvenient person I have ever employed." "You've mentioned that," I said. "The compact is going to have opinions about this." "Probably." "The Ashvelith Principality's restoration process, if there is one, is going to be considerably more complicated now." "Probably," I said again. "She's going to need to come out of the registry," Sel said, "under her real name. The Compact Missing Persons Network has her family line listed as extinct." "I know. That is going to be a significant administrative process." "I know," I said. "I've already started the paperwork." Sel stared at me. "Preliminary documentation," I said. "Identity verification protocols, provisional status adjustment, cross-reference filing to link my contractor code to my name in the missing persons relay so the record is updated. I started it last night." You started it last night. The forms exist. I've filled out administrative corrections before. It's not that different from the medical allocation short count query structurally. Cell put her face in her hands. This was a gesture I had come to understand as her version of laughter. The archive transferred documentation, she said, into her hands. That will serve as corroborating record. Yes, and the compact emergency response team's extraction report, and the medical transit station intake record, and... Stop, she said. Please stop. I'm going to need a moment. I waited. After the moment, she looked up and said, "How is she?" "She's all right," I said. I stopped and started again. "She has been managing for 14 months on her own the way she manages everything, carefully, precisely, putting one thing away before dealing with the next. She hasn't stopped since the evacuation. And now she has someone to do the paperwork with," I said. Cell looked at me for a moment longer. Then she said quietly, "Make sure she eats the broth while it's hot." The restoration process, when it eventually came, was not simple. Nothing of this scale is simple. There were compact legal proceedings and a formal identity verification process that took 4 months, during which Naren lived openly at Diven 6 under her real name, which caused a significant adjustment in the camp's social architecture. People she had been queuing beside for months, people who had shared ration tables with her without knowing, people who had given her their bench space and their queue numbers and their ordinary camp courtesies. They handled it with the particular dignity of people who have been through enough that the extraordinary no longer strikes them as entirely implausible. There was a woman in row 14 named Oreth Velsan, no relation to the name coincidence, just the regional suffix pattern, who had shared a tent partition with Naren for the entirety of the camp stay, and who, when she learned who her tent partner was, sat down on her cot and was quiet for several minutes, and then said, with the flat precision of someone organizing a very large fact into the available space, "You always folded the partition seam before dawn. I thought you were just particular." "I was just particular," Naren said. "Yes," Oreth said, "but also a queen." "Both things can be true," Naren said, in the tone she used when she was being gently direct, and Oreth laughed, the real laugh of someone who has been carrying a long strain and has just been given permission to set part of it down. There were dozens of these conversations in those 4 months. They did not all go smoothly. Some people in the camp were angry, in the complicated way of people who feel they have been near to something important and kept from it, who feel that the proximity was a kind of lie. Naren met every one of them with the same patience and the same directness. She was not performing humility. She had genuinely been living the same life they had been living, eating the same grain cake, waiting in the same relay queue. She could not undo the fact that she had withheld her name, and she did not try to. She could only be honest about why. "I was afraid," she said to the ones who asked. "Not of you. I was afraid of the wrong kind of attention reaching me before I was ready for it. I am sorry for what that cost in honesty. It cost me something too." Most of them, after they had heard this, found a way to make room for it. The archive was central to the restoration case. 300 years of census records, land registrations, legal instruments, succession documentation, the continuous evidentiary record of the Ashvileth line, intact and verified in compact custody. Without it, restoration would have been a much longer and much less certain process. With it, the legal pathway was difficult but navigable. I stayed at Diven 6 through the process. My contract with the compact auxiliary was renewed twice, and then, when the restoration proceedings entered their final phase, it was superseded by something that did not have a standard contractor code. I told you I was not a king. I am still not a king. The Ashvileth Principality, when it eventually began the process of reconstitution, a process that will take years, and that Naren approached with the same methodical precision with which she approached everything else, did not need a king. It needed what it had always needed, the patient work of people who paid attention and stayed. I can do that. There is a passage in the Ashvileth Formal Codex, the one that Naren and I had spent weeks drafting together, in the months before the incursion, writing the guidance that didn't exist so that whoever came after us would have something to start from. That addresses the question of a bond between a queen and a consort of another species. We had written it carefully, formally, in the register of legal instruments, because that was the register the Codex used, and we wanted it to be taken seriously. The passage says, among other things, that the bond is not constituted by ceremony but by choice, and that the choice is not a single moment but a series of moments, and that what distinguishes a consort bond from any other kind of alliance is the quality of attention, the particular willingness to see the person in front of you as they are, and to remain in that seeing even when it is difficult, and to do the work of remaining even when no one is watching. I did not write that passage. Naren wrote that passage. I read it and said it was accurate, and she said, a little formally, as she did when she was moved by something, that she was glad I thought so. The last time we sat in a relief corridor together, it was in the late afternoon, and the light was coming through the translucent polymer of the Block C sidewall, the warm quality of late light through a thin material, and Naren was holding the completed restoration filing, a document that was, at its core, a form, the same administrative structure as every other form I had filed in 4 years of relief work, with fields for name and date and status and corroborating record. And she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at me, and she said, in the voice she used when she was stating something she had decided was simply true and did not require further discussion. The archive is safe, the record is intact, we wrote the guidance. We did, I said. Then we can do what comes next. We can, I said. She folded the document with the clean precision of a person who had been handling formal documents since childhood, and she put it in the carry bag that had started out as an evacuation bag and had somewhere along the way become something else. And she stood up with the quality of movement that I had noticed in a ration line 11 months earlier. Not the movement of exhaustion, but the movement of long training. And she offered me her hand. I took it. We walked out into the camp in the late afternoon light, and around us the ordinary machinery of the place continued. The queue for the communications relay, the Block C document counter, the water distribution point at the eastern edge, the rows of tents stretching out to the perimeter. 1,200 people doing the work of surviving, with the quiet dignity that is available to people who have decided, in the face of everything, to keep going. I had been doing this work for 4 years. I was good at it, and I was not finished with it. There was more of it ahead, different forms of it, in a different context, in a place that was still being reconstituted from the ground up. But that afternoon, in the late afternoon light of Camp Devin 6, walking out with her hand in mine, the broth hot and the archive safe and 300 years intact, I was not thinking about what came next. I was thinking that I had found her, that she had found me, that we had both been looking, carefully and precisely, with the particular quality of attention that refuses to stop, and that the work had carried on and that it had brought us here. That was enough. That was more than enough.